All right, welcome. This is Esoteric Hollywood. I am Jay Dyer of jaysanalysis.com. I want to thank talknetwork.com first of all. If you are listening to this and you are looking for organic food and supplements, check out talknetwork.com where you'll be linked directly to all of Natural News' excellent products. Today I have with me Richard Grove, a special treat, someone who has influenced me quite a bit over the years as I've really immersed myself in Richard's work, and there is quite a bit of content out there. Richard is a whistleblower. He's also a filmmaker, and he is the man from tragedyandhope.com. How are you, Richard?
I'm sorry, dude. I had to cough. Are you able to edit?
I can.
I'm great, Jay. How you doing, man? Thank you so much for inviting me on the show.
Well, I'm glad to have you. This is an honor. It's the man himself, the man behind the curtain. I'm kidding. Your face is actually out there quite a bit. You're not you're not a shadow master.
Yeah, I'm not hiding.
All right. So what I want to talk about first, we're going to be 13-minute segment here. Richard, tell us first, obviously, about you, how you got to where you are, what opened you up, opened your mind up to more than just the state school brainwashing that most of us went through. Tell us about your trek and tell us how you got to where you are.
Well, I think my trek starts with getting some of that state school brainwashing. I went to public high school. I went to a state university. I went there for 5 years because I changed majors, and you know how that works out. I got into the corporate world. I started being very successful, not because of what I learned in college, but because during college, to pay for college, I had started my own business, and learning how to be an entrepreneur really gives you skills that they don't give you in college. For instance, sales is necessary to every business that has a product or service, but they don't give out degrees in sales. So by learning how to run a business during college, that led into a lucrative partial career in software sales. And I lived in Princeton, New Jersey. I lived in Virginia for a while, and then I lived in New York City up until 2003. During that time, I started to discover that the map that I was given was very different than the terrain that was actually, encompassing my work life. And specifically, I thought that, if a company is cheating its clients and companies are putting other companies at risk, that there's laws in place and there's law enforcement to take care of that, and there's courts. And I went through a whistleblowing process as prescribed. So when they say that someone like Ed Snowden went outside channels, I went through the channels. I raised the legitimate concerns, presented the evidence, and, when you go through that process, you expect an audit committee for a company to say, there's a problem, let's see the evidence and let's talk about it. What I got threatened with right away was you have to come see the company attorney without an attorney present. And that sounds like a trap to me. And so in going through and filing my lawsuit and going through the Department of Labor and then going through court, presenting evidence on the record that was denied in the decision, I took that to Lowell Bergman at Frontline. And I'd seen the movie The Insider. I saw John Wygand send him a fax in the movie. I was like, maybe I can do that. And I corresponded with Bergman. He had 2 people investigating it. That went on for like a year, and then he indicated that they can't do anything with it.
Wow.
That it goes against the interest of the people that would be paying to produce the episode, and he can't touch it. So that's when I started thinking for myself, it's like, I've exhausted all the channels that they provide.
Right.
I'm encountering information that's legitimate and putting other companies at risk, and the law enforcement. I mean, after I described the back door that the client, the National Association of Securities Dealers, one of my clients, described it to me. So it's not like I, as an untrained software salesperson, identified this. A client identified it to me and used it as a reason not to purchase the product, and management was present during the meeting from my side. And they wanted nothing to do with that. So there was several other instances, but anyway, after becoming a whistleblower and seeing that there's no fourth estate that's actually going to report this to other people to prevent them from being taken advantage of, I then began to take the world a lot more seriously. Up until then, I didn't really own any history books. I didn't have many books at all, and most of the ones I got were trivial, and I probably bought because they were presented nicely at the local Barnes & Noble and looked cool or something back then.
Now, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Did you go to public school or did you go to private school? What was your schooling like?
I went to rural public school. So it's grades 1 through 6 together and grades 7 through 12 together. And so, and I thought I had known. So when you're presented with information in school and in college, and you think, and you don't check on that for yourself, and you assume that you've got this knowledge, you don't really feel the need to collect a bunch of books and keep reading about stuff because you know about it. And if you're being successful in the world and making a lot of money, that reinforces that ignorance. But that
Absolutely.
ignorance can only survive so long when you're on a battlefield of reality. And then you're going to bump up against a wall and figure out, wait a minute, what I was told is not accurate. So I started to adapt and evolve from then. And really, as an individual, you flourish, you blossom when you get outside the artificiality of those structures. And, you lose your alarm clock and you start doing the things that are important to you, which for me was making a map of the terrain that was accurate. And then if I could, to share what those accuracies were with others so that they could do likewise for themselves.
Let me ask you this. So when you were younger, before you had your whistleblowing wake-up period, did you have a sense of things being synthetic, fake, that we were in this sort of construct of a system, establishment run, or were you completely enmeshed in the system?
No, I wasn't completely enmeshed in the system. I had grown up not thinking that Oswald killed Kennedy, because a lot of the adults, I grew up with a lot of family around. So when somebody was a babysitter when I was a kid, it's somebody, my grandparents, my dad's aunt, people who have been around, and nobody acted like that was the reality of that situation, because they had seen things that contradict. And if you ask them, they all got a story like there's this contradiction or this contradiction. So I grew up with a mild distrust of authority, but I didn't really have a whole lot of historical backing to that. So, I thought the school system, there's nothing wrong with compulsory schooling. We all got to learn somehow, right? Mm-hmm. And, going and paying and getting indentured so you can go to college. There's nothing wrong with that, right? You can't learn how to read books on your own, and you can't do these things outside of that infrastructure. You can't be successful without these things, right? Well, if you make those assumptions and you don't notice that a lot of entrepreneurs don't have college educations,
exactly right?
Right? And that a lot of people without degrees are really, really smart, because the degree is like an artificial scarcity. It's like you've reached the highest point. You're a PhD now. And to get the PhD, you had to defend part of the status quo, because they don't just give out PhDs to people with really alternative ideas and saying, hey, here's an accurate one.
Well, I know that firsthand. That's the track that I was on. I wanted to get a PhD. I wanted to teach philosophy. And I started that course that trek in my life when I was 18, 19. And I worked full time the whole time I was doing that. So it took me a little bit longer. So by the time I was ready to start, PhD work, I was really, just sick of the academic realm. I mean, the academic realm, it was not at all what I thought it was going to be, when I was an idealistic, 19, 20-year-old. And what I saw firsthand was how controlled that whole structure is, how you do not, I'm not exaggerating. You literally don't go into the PhD level of that structure unless you are completely on board. It really is that way. You're intentionally excluded. You might be able to find a university somewhere where you can get your PhD, but the problem is that you will, if you operate outside the realm of what's the sort of the club of the establishment perspective on most things, be it, women's studies in literature, be it, progressivism and radical cultural Marxism in terms of philosophy in academia, whatever area that you're in, unless you're in something like engineering, any of the arts, you're going to be excluded because you're not going along with that program, because they want to make sure that the people that are at the PhD level are teaching, the smarter class of persons, the alpha persons, according to Huxley's Brave New World, that they're following along with that program. So all I can say is that you're absolutely right there.
Well, I think you mentioned the key word. You have to be using those ideas in defense of the realm.
Yes.
They want you. They don't, so you have to be putting another brick in the wall between us and them type of thing, because those people that are defining that system at the top think there are rulers, think that they have the right to rule over other people. And I see there's a number of problems with that. But getting back to your original question, so the idea that schooling gives us anything that we need for later life is only good so far, and then it gets tested, and then you find out you have inadequacies and need to do some learning. After several instances in the corporate world between 2001 and 2003, finally by 2003, I had decided, noticing a corrupting trend going on that was becoming more and more just in your face. Like, people didn't even care by 2003 that they're, ripping people off, and it's not, they don't even have to need to keep it a secret because nobody's going to do anything about it. About a year later, and so it's from then I started doing heavy research, and it took me about a year, and I came across this book called Tragedy and Hope: A History of the World in Our Time by Carol Quigley. It was a book from 1966, and it was at that time out of print. And I'd seen a couple videos that give it a little blurb of what might be in it, and that really enticed me. So then I got the book, I started reading it, and I was like, wow, if I had just been presented with this book, it could have saved me years of trouble, and maybe I'd still have a career because I had at least an accurate map of the terrain and could choose different terrain to explore and wouldn't have ended up where I did. But, yeah, so it's really out of self-preservation. It's a survival instinct. It's like if you find out you're in a situation and there's knowledge that you need, the smart thing to do is to try to acquire it.
Real quick story on that note. It was 2008 or 9, I think. I was doing my grad work, and I was working under this guy who was a radical London-trained Marxist, openly. So that not a conspiracy theory, openly was. And he took over my grad thesis, and basically what happened, long story short, he was more or less trying to sabotage it. And we ended up having this big confrontation in class one day, and kid you not, the book that I had on me was Tragedy and Hope. Is when I was first reading it in 08 or 09. And we actually got in this huge argument over globalism and the 20th century and, the Anglo-American establishment and all that. And the guy was just mocking me. And so I said, well, I've actually got an important document written, by Georgetown professor. Can I quote from it? And he didn't believe me, right? So I pulled out Tragedy and Hope in my hand. And so I opened it. I had it marked, right? So I started quoting the sections about, leftist movements being essentially funded by the private Anglo network and so forth. And
that's like page 925 or something.
So there you go, right?
You're just telling them you're being nice. You're like, hey, dude, you're being played. And if you could just, get in the know, you'd see that both of those sides are getting played out.
And so what he did was he kicked me out. He said, get out of class. So yeah, again, I've seen it firsthand, and that's definitely a seminal book. So I'm really glad that, the site is actually named Tragedy and Hope. That was a great idea. So you've read this, you've seen geopolitics in terms of realpolitik, how it's really going down. What led you then to begin doing the work that you do now?
Well, so you're exploring this unknown landscape. There's a bunch of different sketchy looking internet sites that don't get they tell lots of stories, but there's not a lot of citations and references.
Context. Right? There's not a context, right?
Not context, right? I think, a lot of people now do an excellent job of that. And I think that besides myself, that James Corbett has helped to reinforce that with people. It's like, if you don't have the references and the notes and the footnotes there, it kind of makes it meaningless because you did a bunch of work to find that stuff, but you're not giving people the coordinates to where they can go read it for themselves, which is the cool part of doing all this. Mm-hmm. So, there were certain things about websites that didn't sit right with me. I would listen to different talk show hosts and they'd be presenting information. I'm looking for news, but there's a whole bunch of other hype and all this other stuff going on. And that kind of was like that's kind of thorny. I don't like that. And then I thought, instead of complaining to myself about these things, why don't I try to do something myself and make that what I do? Is not to have commercials every couple minutes, or not to have a bunch of banner ads, or to give the references and to give the footnotes, and to make that the thing that's kind of sexy about it. Is like, there are these artifacts that spell this out very clearly, but not many people talk about them or take the work to find them and produce a piece of media to let other people know about it. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of started from noticing things and a lot of contradictions about the history that we've been told as well. I mean, that's a lot of my early content. And then it's about, what tools do I need if we're experiencing more and more tyranny and they're taking away the skills and habits of freedom? What are those habits? What do I need to pick up? And where are these blind spots? How do I fill them in? If I have an empty toolbox, how do I fill it with the right tools that I need to remain free as an individual? How do I share that with others?
We're gonna
do likewise.
We're gonna take a quick break here for a minute, and then we're gonna come back to Richard Grove. So stay tuned. All right, we're back. We're talking with Richard Grove. We were just discussing the topic of how he got to where he was. And Richard Grove is the man behind TragedyandHope.com. He's also a filmmaker. We're going to be getting into a lot of the films that he's done, some very, very powerful, especially in my own life. State of Mind was an excellent documentary we're going to talk about here in a little bit. But before we get to that, Richard, you were just talking about
Tools in a toolbox.
Right. So finish what you were saying about that toolbox.
Well, when you go through life and you think that the map you're given matches the terrain, you haven't explored too much of the terrain. And when you find that you're in an area that's kind of unexplored, you're going to need some tools. You're going to need some time management, because all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of learning that you thought you did that you really need to kind of do over, because what you did before was just assume that those declarative sentences from public schooling were all true. Mm-hmm. That's not the best facts available on the matter at this time. So time management is figuring out how important is this? Well, it's pretty much a priority, because if you don't have a map that reflects the terrain, all your decisions are going to be askewed. And the predators have planned for this. They've kind of taken that skewed map and put their traps along those skewed routes that you would never be on if you hadn't been lied to about these things. So time management, critical thinking, using our intellectual faculties of logic and reason to discern that which exists and that which doesn't exist, self-reliance, self-defense and self-protection, learning some first aid. These are all different skills that people need to be free, to remain free. If I had to break it down to, the three simple ingredients to the recipe of freedom, it would be intellectual self-defense, physical self-defense, and non-aggression. Mm-hmm. Non-aggression, you got to use it all the time. You always got to manage your state of mind. That way you're not going to be emotionally, making bad decisions. Intellectual self-defense, we need that all the time, because every day you're presented with declarative sentences that pretend that they're facts and they're not. And learning starts with using question marks. So there's that aspect of it. And the physical self-defense, you might need that, 5% of your life, 1% of your life, if you're lucky. These things are sporadic and they're spread out through life, but you still need to know how to remain calm, remain in the regular breathing pattern, fight off your adrenaline rush, all these different things you have to do to manage a situation where there's a high crisis or, a sense of urgency or an attack. You can get carjacked, you can get mugged, someone could break into your house, you could come home and surprise somebody like that. There's road rage, there's all sorts of situations. You could be at a baseball game having a great time, they win, then there's a stampede. You got to protect your family from getting crushed. It's best to have situational awareness and see your way out of that before it happens. Notice the symptoms of it happening.
Karate Kid.
So, Karate Kid.
Learn the crane kick, right?
Yeah, well, the crane kick's an actual real kick.
I did know that.
Yeah, that's a real kick. It's been done in UFC matches. I think it was a UFC and not Metamoris. But I always thought that was a fake kick. I always thought that was, something just Mr.
It does sound ridiculous.
Danielson. Right, yeah. It does. And the kick resulted in a knockout, if I remember correctly. So it's like, the Karate Kid's not the end, it's the beginning. It lets you know that maybe you want to go get some self-defense skills, handle situations. And the truth is, you can never know the outcome of something like that because there's too many unknowns, but you can train for scenarios that might likely, deal with a bear hug or someone trying to pin you on the ground and hit you and, someone trying to put you in a chokehold and things like this. If you know how to get out of those things, they're not so scary anymore, and you can have more self-confidence, and that's the source of real self-esteem that gets us away from conspicuous consumption in our culture, which we can talk about that at some point. Thorsten Veblen, who brought that into our society, also was he was the editor of the Journal of Race Relations, which became the Council on Foreign Relations magazine.
Well, let me ask you this, but you touched on this a second ago, the topic of the Trivium and the Quadrivium. So when I was in my 20s, one of the things I focused on quite a bit was medieval theology and philosophy. So I read a whole lot of Thomas Aquinas and other medieval thinkers, even John of Salisbury. And what I started noticing was that there was this very clear, patterned, structured pedagogy that was the way that you would learn things, of what we now call classical education. And it incorporated so many, there was different strategies, different versions of it, and it goes back to, the ancient Greeks, the ancient world. And many of the even church fathers, for listeners out there who might have a Christian perspective, if you think about Christian theology, most of those Christian theologians and fathers from Augustine to Basil, these guys actually had a classical pedagogy, a classical education. So, Richard, if you would, discuss how this Trivium Quadrivium that you talk about comes out of that and why you promote this. I know that it deals with context and getting us in a position where we can learn for ourselves, but if you would flesh that out.
Well, that could take a whole another show, and I might even want to have a guest host on at that point, Kevin Cole, because he's done the historical research into the Trivium. Mm-hmm. My promotion of the Trivium is not so much about the historical baggage that comes with it, simplifying the 3-step process that came out of a presentation that Gino Denning had given. So there's a mixture of two things. There's the classical Trivium, but that's not described in the past as a input, process, output type of process. So the natural way of learning, which would be you use your observation skills, your five senses, you find the individual parts, that's the grammar. You find how those things interrelate and relate to each other, that's the logic. You remove the contradictions, that's also part of the logic. And then you see how that mechanism, if it's a thing that has many parts, works in action. So that would be the different use cases, and that would be, your troubleshooting area where you can reverse engineer to fix something. So you have this process of what's called grammar, logic, and rhetoric, or to simplify it, it's input, processing, and output. That is separate. That's like a 20th century invention by these Rhodes scholars. And this is according to the research that Kevin Cole has dug up on the historical trivium, because it's really introduced into the National Education Association in 1901 by the Rhodes scholars. So there's this whole thing, or it was 1902 probably, because Rhodes died in 1902. So there's this whole 20th century legacy of the Anglo-American establishment reinitiating the use of the trivium as a control system. And by learning how to learn for yourself, that takes the trivium and kind of inverts it where it becomes a system by which you free yourself and prevent yourself from being controlled by 7 arbitrarily labeled arts of the liberal variety and these sort of ideas that are like an artificial scarcity of information. So there's a process that you can use for yourself to learn anything you want. You don't need a teacher, and you might want to have a teacher, an expert, give you input. But really, you can be a self-initiating person who learns and goes through a variety of topics and can become competent and proficient in those topics. To address the classical trivium and how it came into the 20th century and infiltrated America through like St. John's University and University of Chicago and Aspen Institute, that's probably a whole different conversation.
Yeah, no, I understand that.
I would want to bring those documents to the forefront here and say, let's get into it and get the details and make it really juicy.
Right. And Marshall McLuhan was involved in that. And I'm not, I wasn't looking for, a whole, exposition on it. Just basically an introduction into that, why it was, why it's important. And I know that,
yes. So the cool thing is that it makes, once you understand that using your observation skills to look at the individual parts of anything, and then understanding why those parts work like that, how they fit together, and then learning how to use that thing that you've identified everything. I find most times when something breaks, it's the part that I don't know about.
Right.
And so you're going back through this process in all these different facets of learning that we go through every day. That's the part I promote, because that's the excellent part that they don't really give us in school that would make everything so much easier for people.
Yeah.
The happenstance that it was presented to the world as the Trivium Method then attaches a whole bunch of baggage. So it's almost like getting an app with a virus in it. So we got to remove that virus by understanding, what the history of the trivium is, the classical trivium, and then separating the method of input, processing, and output, because that input, that IPO method, input, process, output, is very useful to individuals, but you don't kind of need that other part running on it with the baggage.
Right. So let's talk about how then, and if you're listening to this and you're interested, you can go to tragedyandhope.com and you'll find all the places where you can begin with learning this method.
There's a tab, I think, at the top menu that says Trivium. And if you're interested in any of what I said about the classical history of the Trivium, the Rhodes Scholars and stuff like that, Kevin Cole just did an interview, I think, with Tim Kelly.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I did listen to that. It was a good talk. So,
and there's also a video that he did that we produced.
All right. Let's talk about some of your films. So you got into filmmaking, and which ones stand out to you as the most interesting interviews and pieces that you've done? Because you've done a lot.
Well, it wasn't all done in one day. It's just a consistent effort over time. Amounts to, if you let enough time pass, there's going to be a whole bunch of trail of breadcrumbs to follow. One of my favorite entries into the whole mix of what's going on and what we're missing was an interview I did in 2012 with an educator named John Taylor Gatto, who's a pretty famous author in America, not as famous as he should be. He wrote a book called The Underground History of American Education. Dumbing Us Down was another one of his books. Weapons of Mass Destruction was another one of his books. So after reading his books and hearing his talks and listening to him on YouTube and, watching grainy videos with bad sound, I thought, this is something I could do. I've been learning how to make films. I'm getting a little bit better at it. I could probably light them. I could probably get the mic. I had 3 mics set up, so I had redundancy. I had some friends come and help me run cameras. I probably could have given everybody a little bit more training than they got. I had a 50-page outline of, I'd studied his life's work and kind of had it in chronological order, and I wanted to get in depth. And when he got here, I tracked him down. It took probably a year to get it all set up because he was traveling and he's like, right back in 6 months, that sort of thing. When he finally got here, he said, Richard, if we had a week, we couldn't shoot this whole, thing with the 50 pages, So we just started having a natural conversation. And what I happened to have up on the screen at that point was, the classical Christian Father, Son, Holy Ghost Trinity logo. And I was trying to explain my understanding of the Trivium Method, the grammar, logic, and rhetoric, or the input, processing, and output. And that's where the conversation started. And then we got into, how the American school system was undermined and the role of secret societies in America. And he talks a little bit about Quigley's Tragedy and Hope in there. And I really think, the best hours are hours 3 through 5, but you got to watch the first 2 hours to understand how those hours come together and what it all means. So I think it was the first thing I did where it was like, I know it's 5 hours, but I'm not going to cut it down shorter just because people have short attention spans. I think that's part of the problem in America. Attention spans have become so short that people can't take in the data that they actually need to be free. And I'm like, that's a deviously brilliant plan, but we can easily undermine it with the technology that we have these days.
Right.
So the ultimate history lesson is the interview that I did with John Taylor Gatto. That was 2012. 2013, I co-wrote State of Mind, The Psychology of Control with Kevin Cole. And that was a film, that was the second film from Free Mind Films, who did OKC, A Noble Lie, which is an excellent documentary. And I think they have a new movie called Shadow Ring, which I saw parts of, and it's high quality. This is the type of thing that I wanted to get into, was over the years figuring out how to raise my production value without breaking the bank, because, we're not making money here doing this. This is not the most lucrative thing that I could be doing with my time, but it's the thing I see most necessary. And just because nobody's like dishing out funding to do this, because there's plenty of unworthwhile endeavors in the world getting funded.
We're gonna
all kind of
hold that thought, Rich. Hold that thought there. We're going to take a quick 2-minute network break, commercial break here. We're going to come back and we're going to be talking about Free Your Mind films and State of Mind. You need to take a break or anything, Richard?
Yeah, let's let this 2 minutes just roll for a second.
Okay.
I haven't been smoking in the house, but I'm not going to go outside.
I've got my vape. I meant to actually get some real cigarettes before
I was going to get a vape, but I just cut back to just a couple cigarettes a day. And it's organic tobacco I roll on myself, so it's
that's awesome, yeah.
It's my caveat. It's not as bad as
All right, I've done that a few times, but yeah. It's easier to buy American Spirits. Hey, do you know that Trinitarian analogy for it comes out of Augustine?
No, but I'm sure Kevin does, because I didn't look into. I only see that stuff like secondhand as he's writing his book. He'll send me some of the documents, and he goes back to Charlemagne and Alcuin of York, and
he should get
Egbert and Egbert.
There's 2 books you got to get on that I could recommend to him.
I don't know them. What are they?
Farrell's God, History, and Dialectic, back when Joseph Farrell did theology, and James Kelly's Anatomizing Divinity.
I think me, you, and him should have a conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah, I put a lot of time into that in my undergrad. I was a medieval philosophy nerd in my 20s.
Lisa's got her headphones on. She walked in. She said, "Kevin would love to talk to him." Yeah, because how many people? I don't know a whole lot of people who read books other than people I know from the internet.
Yeah, exactly.
I've got some friends that read some books, but no one who reads like I do, or Kevin does, or probably you do.
All right, we'll be back in 10 seconds, looks like. All right, we're back. We're talking with Richard Grove of tragedyandhope.com. We were just discussing State of Mind, his excellent film that had quite an impact on me when I first saw it. Very, very good. I do recommend it. You need to get the actual DVD. Get that from Tragedy and Hope. Support the work that they do. I'd also like to again tell the listeners to, if you're looking for organic products that are really good. Seriously. You want to check out talknetwork.com. You want to go to Natural News. You'll see all the links, and they've got everything you need, everything from supplements, any kind of organic product, period. So check out talknetwork.com. And be sure and do it while you're listening to Jay's analysis and Esoteric Hollywood. So, Rich, tell us about State of Mind, how that came together, what that's about, and why everybody needs to watch that.
Well, first off, Free Mind Films' first film, OKC, A Noble Lie, 1995. It's the preeminent example of a documentary on Oklahoma City. It's kind of like if you want to see about Waco, there's a bunch of films. You got to see Waco Rules of Engagement. For Oklahoma City, it's a Noble Lie. So these guys have put out a solid movie. People I showed it to and shared it with thought it had a lot of credibility and was very well done. So I was like, in my mind, like these guys are sharp. Well, they ended up calling me when they were making their second movie and they wanted to interview me, and they came out here. And on the way here, I guess they dipped into a bunch of my work, doing a little homework before they did the interview. And when they got here, they said, look, you can really speak to the whole spectrum of the film and not just one part. Do you mind, if we hang out a little bit longer and film some stuff? I was like, that's fine. So we talked all day, and I cut the film, I cut that footage with them, and they split. And a couple weeks later, they called and said, hey, we lost the lead writer in the project. Would you mind writing the script? And I said, I can see a script for that, and let me see the rest of your footage and whatnot, so I know what I'm dealing with. And I wanted to write it with my friend and research colleague Kevin Cole. So Kevin and I got the 40 hours of footage that they shot. They just sent a hard drive with all the footage. We went through and time coded the whole thing and transcribed all the interviews, which is a lot of work.
Right.
But it makes writing the script easy. Mm-hmm. Because once you have the flow of ideas that the movie's about, and then you can identify this time code right here and this quote, and you can really cut it together on paper and see what it looks like. And then what I did, since I make films, I took the actual footage, started cutting it together. I cut a 6-hour version, a 3-hour version. They wanted a 90-minute version by, it was December 31st was the deadline. So we gave them a 90-minute version with the script. And then they sent it back and they said, well, we wanted to make these changes. Kevin and I adapted the script, and then they released it. That's how that works.
So tell us about State of Mind. What is the subject matter in that film?
Well, the subject matter is that freedom has a physical and an intellectual aspect. And basically the film breaks down the different ways that people are controlled as populations. People are controlled through collectivism, and what they do to individuals as far as, different experiments over time and things like that. So it really brings together a lot of credible evidence and information about the psychology of controlling human beings, and that it has a long history. It's the story of human history. It goes back thousands of years, and we're living through part of that story right now. We're experiencing a high amount of surveillance, and there's a lot of tension out there and things like that. And I think the way to cut through the fear and to deal with the unknown is to use the natural abilities that we have of learning. And that once you start asking questions and learning about the different topics, you find that it's not such a confusing situation at all. It all makes sense. There's people who are greedy and they're plundering people's production. They're doing it in a systematic way. They're waging a full spectrum dominance model against people, and you can't do anything about it until someone makes you aware that it exists, and then you choose to actually, look at the things and the artifacts and evidence for yourself.
One of the things that I liked about that film was that it tied in a bunch of seemingly disparate subjects and topics. So you talked about everything from psychological warfare to education to economics to the way that we're programmed through mass media, and even experiments like MK Ultra and how that actually factored into mass social engineering. So to be able to watch something that actually ties in all of these things, I thought was really powerful. It was really effective. It was done in a very effective way too. So just a tremendous documentary, something that I can't stress enough. You've got to watch State of Mind. Excellent.
Well, what we were trying to do there is just like to summarize for people, because it's hard if you don't watch the movie. The way they break down school is they got different subject areas. You got math, you got physics, you got chemistry, you got biology, and all these different subjects. But they're not teaching you how all these things are interrelating.
Yes.
And what we're trying to do is, yes, these seemingly disparate areas that you don't think connect actually do, and there's an agenda behind it. It's very well funded. It's very well known to the people who are making it known to themselves by looking at the evidence that's available. And yet the masses who are unaware of this is what makes it all possible for it to continue and gain momentum. So it just seemed like, it's there. We see it. We can do something about it. It might not pay us as much as some of the other jobs they're offering in the world, but it seems a lot more worthwhile to me. I get a lot more self-satisfaction out of what I do every day. I haven't cut work or skipped out and played hooky on, the work I do in the past 10 years. Whereas when you work at a corporation, it's like, oh, you might want to call in sick that day. You don't feel like going in.
Right.
It's like my health has improved since I've worked for myself and continued being an entrepreneur. I outgrew the playpen of the corporate cubicle, and I might not have a 401k or retirement plan or anything fancy like that. But when you take steps with integrity, then I like to think that wherever you are is a good place.
Yes. Let's shift gears a bit and get into some of the stuff that before we actually started the interview, we had a good conversation. We were talking about espionage. We were talking about In Fleming, and that actually relates to State of Mind because there was a section of State of Mind where you cover this matter in terms of psychological warfare. And when you delve deeper into that, what you start realizing is that, actually this ties into geopolitics and the spy world, because the spy world is very much about deception. It's very much about trickery and psychology and the theater of war and so forth. And we can go back through history to find really good examples of the tie-in to military intelligence with people like Sun Tzu or Machiavelli, all the way up to the 20th century and the wars that we see that were basically sponsored by the big banking houses of the Atlanticist establishment. So let's talk about espionage and geopolitics and how this relates to the theater of war and why that might be relevant for people to understand.
I can even tie it back to State of Mind, because while we were writing the script, there were a lot of things that we could take from the interviews. Like I said, there's 40 hours of interviews to make a 90-minute film. There's any number of films that we could also cut from that same footage if we had the time and resources. And one of the ways that you can take it, which Kevin and I did, and then we got requests for a little restructure because that's not what they want to cover. But the whole Anglo-American establishment from the time of the late 1898, from the Spanish-American War, where America and England start to grow closer and closer and closer, no longer long-lost cousins. There's like a definite bridge. And like the Atlantic cable for communications, that was first used by the Pilgrim Society. So it's the Anglo-American establishment that's building up this whole infrastructure through the 20th century. And it's really hidden from us through American schooling. Like, they don't tell us anything about this. And I think that should be telling of why aren't we taught about that? Why aren't we there? Why is there no question about this? Because we fought a war against them in 1776 for several years. And then all of a sudden, it's like, if you look today in the American worship of royalty, there's definitely, they've changed the culture and the attitudes, values, behaviors, and beliefs of individuals. So I just try to take it back to, okay, what are we missing here? Well, what you're missing is, like, if you want to talk about espionage, there's an interesting character from the CIA, James Hesus Angleton. And when you get into reading Ed Epstein's books on Angleton, there's at least 2 books on Angleton specifically, because Epstein, who wrote a book, his first book was on the Warren Commission. I learned about this guy, Epstein, Edward J. Epstein, through the Gatto interview. So Gatto's roommate in Cornell was this other guy, Ed Epstein, who became world famous because he wrote a book about the Warren Commission's, the method of deciding. And the famous CIA document, 1035-960, I think it is, the conspiracy theory document, where they're talking about, we're going to use this word conspiracy theory to disparage people. They specifically say it's because of Edward J. Epstein's book on the Warren Commission that they have to write the memo. So if you look in that, so there's this whole thing. So I got into researching all of Epstein's books, and he's written on the gamut. He's got everything from, being embedded with the Oppenheimer family to find that diamonds have no value, and he wrote a book on that. He got embedded with Oliver Stone to make Wall Street 2, so we got to see, behind the scenes of Hollywood production. He wrote a book on that. He got embedded with the news back in the 70s to tell you how network news is produced, and I think it was called News from Nowhere was that book. So he's written 14 or maybe 15, 16, 17 books over the past 40 years. So he's an interesting character. My favorite books were about James Jesus Angleton and his relationship with him and how he got close to ask these questions about espionage. And what you find out is, if I can cut to the chase, it looks like, to me, this is my personal opinion, but Angleton's the mole. He's the guy that can hide the Soviet infiltration in the 50s. All the Soviets that infiltrated, when you map those people out, they got Rhodes Scholars or Anglo-American, Anglophiles, type dudes as handlers that don't ever get touched. So there's this whole undercurrent in American intelligence for that they don't tell us in the books when you read about the origins of the CIA or OSS. Really,
well,
it's Angleton goes to school in Britain and develops a British accent and then gets sent over here, and his dad's in deep with him. I mean, even just that aspect can take you 6 months to just dig through, all those layers and figure it out. But
my colleague, my buddy Mark Hackard, has translated some really excellent pieces that were formerly in Russian that were not available in English. And one of those really good pieces that you would like is called, and I would recommend it to listeners as well, it's called Deception and Active Measures. And you can find this at espionagehistoryarchive.com. And what Mark does is, in that piece, he shows, somewhat in line with what Richard is saying, is that the Red Menace, this game of deception, where you would have these defectors like Anatoly Golitsyn, who would supposedly defect to the West, and they would actually talk about real events ahead of time, like Golitsyn's book, New Lights for Old, actually does talk about the fall of the wall before it occurs. However, what happens is when he supposedly defects, you have Angleton being in control of the actual information that comes out to the public. And so the CIA is actually, gatekeeping what is supposedly this revelation from the defectors. So you're absolutely right. And the reason for that is that for a large part of the Cold War, the Anglo-American establishment was very much embedded and involved in funding a lot of these Soviet, the Soviet structure, the industrialization through Stalin and so forth. So there's very much a dialectical game that's theatrical at work there. So, and I mean that's not saying that there aren't actual spies. The level of on the ground there are Soviet moles and things like that. But very much a deceptive leak, and it is Angleton who is the point man on that.
Yeah, and were you referring to when you said he did some transcriptions or some translations? Were those Venona intercepts that were in Russian?
No, this is actually the writings of KGB General Grigoriev Pavlov. So there's a whole bunch of. He was actually the head of Chief Directorate for Foreign Intelligence for the KGB. So Mark actually and I both have a whole bunch of articles at a whole separate site, Espionage History Archive, where we cover a lot of this. But because Mark has skills with translating Russian, he's able to bring a lot of these previously unknown texts from the Eastern perspective, from the Russian perspective, into English. So there's a wealth of info there that has never been translated into English. So.
Well, and the thing that I would do when I read that article is I would go through and the general that you named, I don't know his name. So he's going to end up in the history blueprint, because when I read an article like that has a lot of useful organized information that I can go ahead and fact check and figure out, I make sure that I don't forget that or where I found it. Mm-hmm. So I would attach his document off to the side and it would link to that, and that would integrate it to my understanding of KGB and GRI and all those other good Cold War groups.
And you have a lot of that at tragedyandhope.com, right? You have a lot of that.
Yeah, there's also on the top menu there's a link that says the brain or the brain model, and all the listings under there they're separate doors into the same model. And the cool thing is that I use it all the time is the search feature in the middle of the screen on the left. You can type in Golitsyn, then you can see the network up and down, and you can see for yourself. It's not there to be conclusive to anybody. It's like the general grammar. These are points that you should explore.
Hold that thought real quick. Hold that thought, because we're going to take a 1-minute break for commercial, and we'll be back, and we're going to be talking more about espionage in the Cold War. You want a break or you want to keep going?
No, I'm good.
All right. We're back. We're talking with Richard Grove. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood with Jay Dyer from jaysanalysis.com. Richard, we were just talking about the brain software that you have that helps people who really want to do real research actually document and keep track of these names and these connections, these nodes in all this madness that is 20th and 21st century geopolitics, the great game and the theater of war. So tell us more about that and whatever else you've uncovered when you were reading. You were mentioning Epstein and his works. Anything else pertinent to the Cold War or Soviet moles that you uncovered there?
Well, sure. The personal brain software is it's a generic piece of software that anyone can buy, or you can download it and use it for free. I created a model years ago, and I've continued to add as I learn, I continue to add as a habit into that model. so that I can remember and recall all the various resources and places where you can find all these juicy tidbits. It's like it's the details of my map, so I can remember where to find these things. And it's in a format such that I have a desktop app, and then I can synchronize it to the web app. The web app's available for free. It's the top menu at tragedyandhope.com. And all the different doors that you see are entry into the same model, but you can explore and see how they're interconnected. You can also search, and anything that we pretty much talk about in this conversation is either already in there or I'll add it in there. And it's a tool I use for myself, but it's also useful for other people who, instead of starting at scratch and just doing a Google search, you can go in, you can start clicking attachments, start reading the general information on a Wikipedia page, but only if it's validated by its footnote, and you can go see the sources and stuff. And that's where it becomes really interesting, because now you're actually doing your own research. Mm-hmm. This is something that we went through 15,000 hours of public school and didn't do for ourselves. So it's a really cool process. And when I end up adding things into the history blueprint, it goes on, because every time you're clicking into a new subject or mapping on a new area, there's like 15 pages you have open, and you go through those tabs and you add them in, and then you got to open some more pages because these other things connect to these other parts, and you keep it to a practical level. You don't put anything into your model that is extraneous or doesn't have any continuity. Otherwise it doesn't have any place in there. So I keep it for my work purposes, my research purposes. I make it available to my audience. I use it in video presentations, and I find it extremely useful because it's another layer of the learning process that helps you recall all these juicy details. Ed Epstein, I've included some of his works in, I think it was Peace Revolution episode 28, Diamonds, the Jewel of Denial. Mm-hmm. And in there's a whole documentary where Epstein lays out just the diamond information. I plan on interviewing him later this year, probably, I'm hoping in November. I've got another project to edit before I can do another interview, because I hate filming something and having to wait 6 months in my workflow till I can edit it. Mm-hmm. It's like a pet peeve. But the interview with Epstein, I think it might have to be a multi-session interview. Maybe like I go there once a month for the next 6 months or something, because after reading his books, I think each one deserves its own documentation, and then I can cut those together somehow. Or I might end up just doing like a super interview over 2 days, like 7 hours or something like that.
Right.
The interview I have to edit next, it was a 7-hour interview with John Loftus, who was a Department of Justice attorney who was looking into Nazis being brought to America under Operation Paperclip. And that was, that's one of my favorite interviews, but it's not released yet.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that book, and Loftus was actually the one that, at the time of the 7/7 bombing, pointed out that I believe it was Aswat was working for MI5.
Well, and then that brings up, I heard you talking about Secret Affairs in an interview probably with Tim Kelly. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I just got done reading that book, and it's written by Mark Curtis, who's a member of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. So it's not a conspiracy theory book. Right. And in there, he clearly documents Britain's history, at least in the 20th century, of funding Muslim extremism. And then once you get into the Loftus interview, you'll hear John talk about the origin of the Saudi kingdom and how it's tied intimately to British and American intelligence and oil companies. And there's all this, and like he's read the 28 pages of the 9/11 Commission report about the Saudis. It's blacked out, and everyone's like, no, they need to release it. Right. So I asked him, we talk about that. And I think it all starts to come together for people that if you look at the history of the century before 9/11, you don't need to ask who did 9/11. It's like, it's right. There's only one group. It's a finite planet. Yeah, Operation Gladio exists, and it continues. I'm thinking in some other form or under some other name. Gladio B, maybe?
Yeah, and you really do have to look at the history, because it's that same network that is behind this Salafist, Wahhabist strategy of the British Royal Society that Quigley is describing in Tragedy and Hope, the same network that's running the so-called leftist and Soviet communist type movements in the U.S. that the Birchers and McCarthyites were so afraid of that they misidentified that Quigley speaks of. And so I think you have to go back to, Lawrence of Arabia, Harry St. John Philby, these British spy masters that were at work carving up the Middle East as we know it today. So to understand,
it's like the Cliveden set and their minions, basically. The Cliveden set was a section of is the wrong word, of British aristocracy.
Yes.
That was favoring the Nazis, and it include, I think, what's his name, King Edward.
It was Edward, right? and his wife.
And recently they just released all that footage of the Queen doing the Heil Hitler salute and stuff like that, how they were being taught Nazi salutes among the royal family. That I don't think that was supposed to be out, but someone found that in the archive. I mean, because what would you do back then? Would you mark on there so that people could find it later that here's the Queen doing a Nazi salute? Or do you think they just said, Queen when she was a child, and then somebody today is putting together a documentary, pulls that footage, finds that, and just leaks it and figures releasing that footage is more important than keeping their job?
Yeah, there were those factions. And if you look at somebody like Ian Fleming, it was Ian Fleming who, according to at least recent research that's been divulged, I guess is the right word, concerning what he did in a lot of his black ops / naval intelligence work, was that he was kind of the guy who hatched that plan to coax Rudolf Hess into parachuting into Scotland. So, but there actually was that faction of the British elite that you're talking about. There actually were pro-Nazi. The others were not pro-Nazi. They were genuinely, wanting to combat the Axis powers. And I tend to think that Fleming genuinely wasn't pro-Nazi. I know about what his personal library was, and he did have quite a bit of treatises on eugenics and race theory and all that. So I suppose a thesis could be made that maybe he was into it. I don't know, but he tended to at least hatch psyops for the Allied powers that were anti-Nazi. So all kinds of crazy stuff like that surrounding the character of Ian Fleming.
I think it's even more fascinating than that. First, I want to mention it's like people might be skeptical. Here's one of the most credible references on this topic. It's a book called The Irregulars. It's by Jeanette Conant, Jennet, Conant, Conant. She's the granddaughter of James Bryant Conant, who worked on the Manhattan Project. He also worked at Harvard. He's an educator that John Taylor Gatto had mentioned during the Ultimate History lesson. And so it's funny. It's like, here, the families do kind of work together, whether it's on the American side or the British side, and there's a continuity over generations of this work. So Conant's work on The Irregulars shows how British spies came to America in 1938 and ran assassination squads and infiltrated the White House and ran PR campaigns and all this different stuff. So it's a very legitimate establishment written referenced book, and it's not a conspiracy piece. They wrote it as part of their history. Going to Ian Fleming, when I started to dig into him from there, I got all the books, all the relevant books on Ian Fleming. So I have a whole bunch of them out there. I read through them. I started, adding them to the history blueprint, and his brother Peter and his brother Peter's in the Bullington Society. They're both in, Peter at least was in Special Operations Executive. Then you can get to Camp X, where they train the assassins in Canada. And there's a rumor that Ian Fleming went there and didn't pass the kill test. One of the recent resources I saw, I think it came from the BBC, was there was a new series called Fleming, the Man and the Mystery, or something like that. And in there they show how he goes to Camp X to take the assassination test and fails, how he gets asked to create the blueprints for the CIA and gives those to Wild Bill Donovan. And there's all these things that it's like, from the British side, here's what they're saying about our intelligence apparatus. So as somebody looking into that, it's relevant to me. I'm going to check that out. And when you start comparing, just like the whole franchise of James Bond as it comes out, it's like, here's this British agent. He's working in America. The CIA is a putz named Felix, and he's always a step behind James Bond. And it's like, that's to indoctrinate America into a system. And it's been going on for 50 years successfully, and people find it entertaining without seeing the irony. It's like, there's a plan and agenda going on. And you might say, what's the connection between the James Bond movies and the stuff where Ian Fleming's an actual spy and things like that? But if you look in the Special Operations Executive, this group of spies that Britain had created, a lot of those guys end up working on James Bond films as directors, producers, set director. Ken Adam, who worked with Stanley Kubrick, like that guy is a British spy during World War II. And not just the spy. Special Operations Executives, like an elite commando unit, and Fleming created, I think it was AU-38 or something like that. Right, yeah. AU-30, the commando unit. And so a lot of the things you see in his books, he's not making that stuff up. He's just reorganizing his past and presenting it in a humorly fashion. And then you look at the, when Edward abdicated, he went to the Bahamas. Well, then look at these other spies that go to the Bahamas afterwards, or Bermuda. And then you start to see an infrastructure of ex-spies and ex-heads of state who might be operating something like Spectre in reality.
Absolutely.
While he's writing about this stuff. And it's like, it's too interesting not to look into for myself.
Yes.
And then not to share with people.
Yeah, there's a great book by Craig Cabell, Cabell, called In Fleming Secret War. And he details all these very things. I'll read a brief quote here. The realistic spy takes some of the features of the genuine spy world and exaggerates or exploits them. It portrays a universe in which certain characteristics like friendliness and companionship are absent, and the qualities of loneliness and ambiguity of role and motive are emphasized. A world in which both friend and foe are outsiders belonging to a professional community with its own conventions. And that's Graham Greene, the fiction writer, who also was a British spy. So Graham Greene, known for Our Man in Havana and other stories. So another great book to look at if listeners are interested in delving deeper into that subject matter. But it was actually Fleming that helped Bill Donovan set up the OSS. So we have to keep in mind that the OSS, the beginning of the America's official Secret Service establishment, what would later become the CIA, was actually set up more or less on the British model. It was a bunch of British spies that came over and helped set that up. And that's actually in Bill Donovan's biographies. If you check out any of those biographies, you will come across that topic. So we're going to take a 2-minute break here coming up. And we're talking espionage, Ian Fleming, and the character of Bond. And so when we get back, I want to talk about other tie-ins to Hollywood, and Richard mentioned Kubrick, so I'm sure Richard has some interesting facts that we can get into on that. He's done a lot of research on all this, and this is a powerful interview, so stay tuned. You want a break? You want to keep going?
Yeah, you can keep going.
Okay. Welcome back. We're talking with Richard Grove of tragedyandhope.com. I am your host, Jay Dyer, and this is Esoteric Hollywood. Richard, tell us what you know, anything else, any other interesting tidbits and connections from your research between Fleming, Bond, Hollywood, British intelligence, or maybe even Kubrick.
Well, what I would say is, before we get to Kubrick, if you just went to the Wikipedia page of any of the James Bond movies created in the early 60s, for instance, and you start to go through and ask yourself, when people are given a producer credit or a director credit or, some of these other higher credits in there, just click those links and see what the history of that person is. Mm-hmm. And if you find that there's 5, 6, 7 of these guys working among these films that all used to work together during the war, then you see that connection again between wartime propagandists and like peacetime entertainers. That's like in America where it's, got, C.D. Jackson working in psychological warfare in World War II. And then he comes out of there and he's running Fortune and Life magazine and stuff like that. Right. Yeah. So there's a trend in America, and America's intelligence apparatus really didn't exist in the 1800s too much. Mm-hmm. And so we learn all these things that we think are so American. Britain has a big brother of our system. And they've been running their system for longer. Like our NSA, that's, everyone talks about it. GCHQ came around in 1901. They were tapping telegraph lines and tapping the Atlantic cable and they fought a whole war before the NSA came around. So NSA learned its signals intelligence from working at Bletchley Park and working on the Enigma codes and stuff like that. Yes. And really, if you're Britain and you're a small country like that, you want to outsource some of these tasks to the bigger country with more people and more land and more resources. And that's the Destroyers for Bases campaign in World War II, where we, give them some ships and they give us all these properties around the world that we got to maintain and staff with our personnel. And that gets us more into the globalist, we got to be imperialists and we got to go around and spread freedom, and this whole sort of idea that's really wrecked freedom in our country and other countries around the world. Yep. The ill feelings that are out there from so-called terrorists, a lot of it, if it wasn't legitimized in 2001, it's legitimate by now. We've spent billions and billions and billions of dollars destroying other cultures. And they didn't have anything to do with 9/11 if you look at the evidence. So that whole thing where it's like, they told us this story, so we had to go do that. No. We're individuals, we're responsible for our actions, and we're also responsible to keep lies out of our head. And that's how you got to look at these situations. So getting back to Ian Fleming and Bond and how this all ties in, when you get in and start doing immersive learning, and getting into, like the In Fleming family, he's like fourth generation billionaire.
Yeah, Valentine was a banker, right?
Yeah. Well, Valentine was a banker, but Valentine's father, I believe, had started Fleming and Company. And if you look at Fleming and Company and their interminglings with Jardine Matheson, one of the biggest opium conglomerates of the British East India Company,
Bingo.
and Jardine Fleming, they just recently merged in 1970. So the things that went on during the Opium Wars, those business relationships are still there. And until you learn things like HSBC, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank Corp, is British East India Company, and that the reason that the British had Hong Kong for the past, for 99 years up until they turned it over, there's all these underlying aspects to it, and it's like, wait a minute. When we were in Vietnam,
drugs.
it's all based around controlling people through controlling their pain. That's why they do the drug trade. And notice they don't, the drugs they're controlling people with are pretty deleterious to their health.
Right.
It's not like they're controlling people with pot. They're using opium and heroin and cocaine and all these things that destroy lives. And and then when they're willing to destroy not only the people our age, but the youngest among us, the oldest among us, as part of this, because they think that they are from a class structure, a caste structure, really, that India gave to Britain through that process of being conquered, and it's being inherited here. And here people were supposed to be equal. This was why America was supposed to be a little bit different, even if they didn't recognize it right away, over time, it seems like steps have been taken to recognize that if you're a human being, you're a human being, regardless of your color or your creed or religion.
Yeah, it's a strategy of weaponizing things. So you can weaponize the drug trade where it's not just a matter of making profit. It's also a matter of weakening some target population or your enemy.
So now you know that, like, Ian Fleming comes from a billionaire family. He and his brother were both spies. His brother became a famous writer. Mm-hmm. And some of the other people that were in the irregulars with Fleming coming to America was Roald Dahl.
Yep.
So Fleming wrote Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, kids book. So you got a British spy writing kids books. Why is he doing that? Roald Dahl, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Why you got another British spy coming in this country and writing popular kids books? Mm-hmm. Because they're indoctrinating us in some shape or form, even if it's just their cover story, right? And so there is what was the other guy from an advertising company? So through the irregulars, that was a good book where I was connecting in. Here's this British establishment. Here's this American establishment. Quigley tells me that they've got a goal that's existed since they got into the drug business back in the 1800s together, or earlier.
Yeah, and this is actually, there are authorized biographies of Cecil Rhodes that talk about this too. Cecil Rhodes' Colossus is a book I read.
I've got Colossus.
Flawed Colossus, excuse me. And I read that a few years ago. And that actually details the whole fact that he really was funded by the Rothschilds. He really did go and set up the diamond monopoly. And that system of slave camps and so forth that would serve as the model for gulags.
Well, and still the apartheid state that they created was the model for the gulag, and it's the same model adopted by Israel to use against the Palestinians. It's a form of apartheid.
Yes.
And so you see this, and it's the same sort of thing that Hitler was using over there. And these things are not disconnected because they do have common threads of funding, through collaboration, through different working groups and the interrelationships between the boards of directors of these working groups, the funding, the nonprofit foundations that chip into it, the covers that they make as far as intelligence agencies, Operation Mockingbird, where the intelligence establishment was controlling and influencing media. And that goes all the way back to Oscar Callaway in 1917, where he told the Congress, he's like, the papers and media outlets, I don't know if they had radio stations back then, maybe a little bit, were being bought up by the big corporate interests. And that happened as a function of corporate personhood, which meant, unlike human beings, these corporations who are accepted as people don't have to pay for their actions.
Well, this was part of the reason Orson Welles got into trouble for making Citizen Kane. was that it was something that William Randolph Hearst was not very happy about. And as I understand, at least, Orson Welles had to deal with that quite a bit afterwards. In terms of his career, he suffered greatly from making a movie that was very critical of that takeover of the Fourth Estate.
I think it would have been more effective if Orson Welles had smoked a little pot, or a little cannabis rather, And he had incorporated Hearst's movement against hemp and cannabis and that whole prohibition aspect. That really could show people. It's like, because when you had prohibition on alcohol, people think that means drinking. But in rural areas, they ran farm machinery and cars on alcohol. The first cars back in the 1800s, I think, ran on some sort of battery. So they were electric cars. So these ideas have attempted to be developed. But once the Rockefeller, conglomerate situation, their empire, got wind that they could use this thing they were throwing away, gasoline, as a fuel, and then they got a couple manufacturers to change over things, that prohibition stopped all the stills and anyone that had an alternative form. And from there, they could give you alcohol back, and they could take hemp away. Because taking hemp away in the long term meets all their goals. It means everything's going to be made out of oil, so they got to destroy the land and do all this sort of stuff where it's very destructive, or you have oil spills and all this other stuff that goes on. Then everything's made out of those plastic products. It's not biodegradable. It's going to poison the ecosystem, and it's going to create more and more artificial scarcity. So they know that there's a better system available, that they could use hemp and the decorticator, and they could make hemp plastic and hemp paper and hemp clothes and all these things that would be biodegradable and really sturdy.
Yeah.
That also plays against their profit model, because you won't need to buy stuff every day. It's not artificially disposable.
I'm from Tennessee, and I still presently live in Tennessee, and anybody from the Kentucky, Tennessee area knows about hemp, because Henry Clay, that was his major cash crop. So he's a famous senator from Kentucky, and that was his major cash crop. That was before, like you're talking about, these oligarchs came in and intentionally made it illegal so that it could be monopolized, so that you could have the DuPonts and these other families have this monopoly on these different chemicals and so forth, so they can control it. Exact same model as the diamonds and Cecil Rhodes, right? So it's absolutely no different.
Well, and diamonds are popularized during that same sort of time of Prohibition, World War II. People were confused, so they're getting that programming. And Hearst, the reason that Citizen Kane ended up making it out, because I think Hearst blackmailed a bunch of people, and they wanted an indirect way to get back at him, right, and to put him in his place, because he had been useful in 1898 when they drummed up the Spanish-American War. Like, he helped them get on the road to imperialism, but he's a small guy compared to some of the British press magnates,
right?
And some of those guys like Lord Northcliffe, who at one point he's like one of the lead guys on the Anglophile side. And then, he says a couple wrong things, and then he ends up off the map, and he's gone. It's like, so they're also willing to take those people at the top and make them interchangeable parts, which makes it hard to believe that people will be so loyal to a system that's trying to degrade and erode freedom around the world. But I guess if you're not creative, that's the only way you think that the empire can survive or whatever. I guess that's what they do.
Well, it's
our job to deal with it.
There's a historian that I find useful. I don't recommend everything from him, but I'm a big fan of Oswald Spengler. And in Decline of the West, he talks about the natural progression of imperial powers, and he sees them as having a life cycle, like they have a sort of organic birth, flourishing, and then sort of an apex, then it decays. And he sees from patterns in history, at least, that as just sort of the natural progression of the imperial power, the imperial impetus. And so the empires have that problem where they get to the point where they're so big and they're trying to do so much and they want to keep expanding that they have to basically adopt nothing but lies. And so once the whole mythos of the empire is complete lie, it starts to collapse in on itself. And that's exactly what we've seen with every imperial power throughout history. And it's no different now, right? So the British Empire begins to collapse from corruption. And what happens? Well, they go underground and they reconquer any opposition, such as the colonies in the United States of America. And they do that through the banking power primarily. In 1913, the Federal Reserve, and then that allows economic control that then sets up these later governmental agencies like the OSS and the CIA, and then all the multitude of, intelligence agencies and government agencies that just explode out of this. And this leads eventually to the NSA, which we now, live under. And you did that excellent interview with William Binney on the NSA that I thought was stellar. It was golden. And so here we are, right? So you want that kind of an imperial, you want to live under that kind of history, that kind of a setting. What does it lead to? It leads to NSA. That's what it leads.
There's hope in recognizing the pattern as it's going on. I mean, because we're still in a live situation here, so that, you know, tomorrow new things are going to roll out. They're going to try to distract us with stuff. I like to keep it real by looking at the history. Carol Quigley also wrote a really good book called The Evolution of Civilizations, and he shows how, you know, you could say that these civilizations rise and fall, but really it looks like they exhaust their fuel and move on to another place to feed.
That's what they do, right?
So it's like a virus of empire.
That's what I'm saying. They become parasitical, right?
And so in the history blueprint, I put, there's a tab, there's a thought called the Reconquest of America, which is a formalized goal of the British Empire. So it's an ongoing goal that they've had since they lost the war in 1814 with the Battle of New Orleans. They've tried to take us over via different mechanisms, not, you know, sending troops directly to our place and like with the redcoats back in the day.
All right.
And evidence of this you can see in the CIA. The CIA, inside the CIA, called the Office of Policy Coordination, the OPC, which was a bunch of Anglophiles in the State Department.
Hold that thought on the OPC and the Anglophiles in the State Department. We're going to take a quick break. Be back with Richard Grove of TragedyandHope.com. You want to take a break? You want to keep going?
Yeah, can you just, how long is the break?
2 minutes.
Like 2 minutes? I'll be right back. I'll refill my water. I assume if I was late, you'd just start talking and cover it.
Well, I can always pause it too. It's not a big deal. All right. We are back with Richard Grove of TragedyandHope.com. This is Jay Dyer. You're hearing talk to you through this radio. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood on TalkNetwork.com. Richard, we were just talking about the CIA again and how this gets into the decay of empires. Tell us about what you were saying with the OPC.
Well, for a long time, I was kind of crediting everything that is official CIA history to the CIA, like Operation Ajax, where they overthrew Mossadegh in 1953 in Iran, or any of the other coups that they performed with British intelligence. You think those are CIA, but when you look at the people involved, you know, Operation Paperclip, bringing in the Nazis versus investigating the Nazis, there's a convection current going on. And the input is the Office of Policy Coordination, which was part of the CIA, but it ran off a State Department budget. And that's where things get really dicey, because when you look at someone like Norman Dodd, the whistleblower from back in the 40s in the Reese Committee, he said that the Carnegie Institute for International Peace had come up with this plan, and they wanted to figure out how to take over our mechanisms of state. And that, you know, they could do that through controlling the State Department and through other, you know, assets that were there, that could be strategically mapped out and conquered over time. So when a group of people, and Carnegie was an Anglophile who wanted to see America rejoined with Britain, just like Cecil Rhodes, only, to my knowledge, Carnegie's will didn't specify the creation of a secret society and a scholarship trust for that purpose, right?
Right.
So when you look into OPC and its history, now I mean, I'm not saying the CIA is good or that any of the stuff that's done over the years are really honorable in the whole scope of things, because you got individuals there who are either in on the lie or being lied to.
Exactly.
And you got contradictory actions going on and running, cover for an elite global drug trade.
Yes.
That has existed for hundreds of years. And when you look at, the 60 or 70,000 individuals from the American side who were soldiers who died in Vietnam, and you look at the millions of people who were displaced or injured in that war, and you think about what's the strategic assets over there, what's going on, who ran it before, what were the French doing there, are they ever known to be involved in the drug trade? Mm-hmm. And you start looking at Operation Phoenix and Air America, and you start connecting it in with the British banking infrastructure that had been with the East India Company and had this whole infrastructure already set up. You see that, in current day politics, America has taken over the foreign policy to manage Afghanistan, which was a project of the British Empire. And I think they had 3 Afghan Anglo wars.
Yep.
And, you see our control over Iraq. Well, guess what? That was another British project for a long time under mandate. And then you see these things being handed off as different sub-projects, maybe to different countries. When you look at the creation of Israel and Britain's involvement in that's a whole series of study that might take you several months just to get to some meaningful primary sources that give you the picture.
Yeah, British intelligence also helped set up the Mossad too. So it's not just the CIA or the OSS that was put in place through machinations of the technique of the old school spy network going all the way back to Elizabeth and John Dee and those spies. The old school British spy system is what was set up in the U.S. and in Israel.
Well, when you look at the creation of the Mossad, the early Mossad training came from people like Reinhard Gehlen, who was an SS intelligence officer for Nazi Germany, who was brought by the Americans and British back to America, to the Pentagon, then sent over to train the Mossad. So why would they have a Nazi general who's in charge of their Eastern intelligence at the time, be somebody who's training the Mossad, unless there's an overlapping between American intelligence, German intelligence, British intelligence, and Israeli intelligence? Like all of those things have commonalities to them, and you're not going to see it through looking at the official stuff that they're posting in your face everywhere. You need to look at the actual origins of these institutions,
Richard,
because you had a lot of Rhodes Scholars that were in Germany before World War II.
Richard, there's just no way. How could that be? Richard, why did Bill Donovan train Mao's guerrillas?
Probably.
I thought the CIA and the OSS, I thought they were against communists. I thought there was.
Well, if I had to guess at a reason, I'd say it had something to do with the Rockefeller interests in China. And Nelson Rockefeller he's working in psychological warfare for the military during World War II. In Rockefeller Center, where British security coordination, so British headquarters for intelligence, is also below Nelson Rockefeller's office. There's this ominous continuity between the banking and monopoly interests and the ruling power structure of the British Empire that we tried to get away from in 1776.
Yes, Chase Bank was the first big bank allowed into communist China. And I'm sure
that brings up like Arm and Hammer.
Yes.
So Epstein wrote a great book on Arm and Hammer and the whole Russian connection, as well as you know, but I'm hoping your audience also knows, Anthony C. Sutton, who wrote 3 books just on Western technology in Russia. Then he wrote his other trilogy on Wall Street and the Bolsheviks and Wall Street, FDR, Wall Street, and Hitler. Mm-hmm. And these are some of the other essentials that I consider with Quigley's 4 primary books, including the Anglo-American establishment and weapon systems and their development. Because really, he describes in Tragedy and Hope that we lost the ability to be equal with the government when we lost equal armaments during World War II. Where it's no longer if you have a rifle and the government's got a rifle. It's like now they got big stuff that you can't necessarily overcome with, strategic arms of a personal variety. And so now you got to figure out a different way to overcome that and be free, because you can't go toe to toe like that anymore. And so that's a change in weapon systems and technology. That was Quigley's last book that he was doing when he died. It was just recently published.
Yeah, two other good books here. This is turning into audio footnoting here, which is great. This is not typical talk radio, which I hope you listeners appreciate that. You're getting hardcore, real information here. There's a great book, Wild Bill Donovan, which is written by Douglas Waller, that describes all the intrigues of Bill Donovan. And when you start getting into these actual books like Tragedy and Hope, like the ones we're talking about, that's where you start seeing that none of this stuff's hidden. There's another book, The Chinese Secret Service by Roger Falagot and Remy Kaufer. And that book also describes at length Bill Donovan setting up the spy network in China that would be Mao's spy network, right? So we think of the communist Chinese as this threat, this enemy. It's all set up by the Western power elite.
Well, and one last book, if I can just add one to the top of the heap, would be the one that Chris Milligan published at Trine Day called America's Nazi Secret. It's a reprint of a 1981 book called The Belarus Secret, but that's not such a catchy title. So they spruced up, gave it a new cover, gave it a new title, and it's got some new information that's added to it. And that's the quick and easy summary of how the Office of Policy Coordination nestled itself within the CIA and continues to this day to have buried a lot of secrets that adversely affect our freedom.
Yeah, the CIA page itself, CIA.gov, actually has the whole history of Bill Donovan training mouse guerrillas on it. There's a whole piece on there.
Because they don't see a problem with the fact that 60 million people died under communism, because right. Brzezinski says that Marxism/socialism/communism is a stage through which we have to pass.
Yes.
It's not the end stage. It's just if they're going to break down freedom, we're going to have to pass through that so they can get to their stranglehold. And I'm just saying, if we see that move coming and we know an effective block, we can redirect their energy and redirect people's attention elsewhere where they can get something nutritious and substantial for their time, then the free market will take its course.
Speaking of that, this is another question I had written down to ask you. I remember when I was doing a lot of 9/11 research a few years back, I started seeing, that's where I came across some of your stuff, and I saw other people like Indira Singh talking about the backdoor technology, talking about the insider trading that was going on. And you hit on the subject matter that almost no one talked about. Now, Corbett recently did a discussion of this and mentioned some of the missing money and all that. But I found a long time ago there was an article, I can't remember if it was the Washington Post or it may have even been something like Asia Times or something like that, some foreign site. But it had to do with AIG and insurance fraud in relationship to 9/11. And now, if you could, if this is too deep of a topic, but if you could give us a brief insight into how this corruption that we've been talking about with the imperial power and the bankers and the oligarchs, we can see an insight into that in these black market operations that also include things like insurance companies.
Well, let me think what's the shortest path through that long topic. You got to go back to the creation of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve founders, among the guys that founded that, they then created another corporation called the American International Corporation, AIC. You'll see Anthony Sutton write about this. There's a lot of records that are out there about that corporation. What you see is they funded Soviet Russia and Communist China, and that it was founded by these robber barons who had already sucked the wealth out of America building the transit systems. Now they went over to new territories. So with AIC, it then spawns into, you get to World War II, you got Cornelius Starr, who's then the founder of AIG. He's working in the OSS. The preeminent fact source on this would be Los Angeles Times article called The Secret Agent Insurance Men. And if you read through there, you're going to see something called X2, which refers to the American version of the double-cross system, which the British intelligence had set up to infiltrate Germany and Japan's intelligence. Double X, 20, in the Roman numeral system is the equivalent to X2 in the American system. So these are Americans who are loyal to Britain, of which Angleton was one. Dulles brothers were involved with that. And that's where you see, that's the main artery of how they infested into our intelligence system. Cornelius Starr, who founded AIG, coming out of the OSS, works intelligence and insurance into the same sort of company. So AIG becomes a front for CIA. What I had noticed during my personal work experience is my largest client at the time was Marsh & McLennan, which is the world's largest insurance brokerage, and it was run by, the CEO was Jeff Greenberg. Jeff's dad, Hank Greenberg, was in charge of AIG. He's the founder of AIG. He was also on the Federal Reserve Board. He's also a CFR member. So what I saw on 9/11 was Marsh & McLennan is occupying the floors in World Trade Center 1 where the events start, where the building explodes. And then there's insider trading going on Marsh and McLennan the weeks before. So it's like there's,
right.
My question was, how did the terrorists do that? How did the Islamic extremists do that? And then I was like, I didn't even know who these, cause the client, like I didn't really use Google back then and see what the client did. I went to a meeting. They told me what they did. They got a lot of IT stuff going on. They need a solution. Like I wasn't digging in to be like, who runs these companies? But after you start to look at this stuff and you're like, oh, wait a minute. The guy that was signing off on this stuff, his dad was doing this thing. We built this thing to connect these two things together. There's a whole bunch of fraud going on. And you keep looking, and instead of seeing, oh, this is easily explained, you find more and more ominous details of intelligence being involved with Wall Street, being involved with insider trading and the stealing of gold. There's another good article. It's by Jim Dwyer, and it was called The Gold Below Ground Zero, or The Vault Below Ground Zero. Mm-hmm. And then you see that, the company that Marsh and McLennan owns, which is called Kroll Associates, which is like this black water type of military contractor, security company, all this stuff. They're in charge of moving the gold from underneath the World Trade Center. And then there's a bunch of gold missing. There's all these anomalies. And I'm thinking, how did the 18 hijackers who were dead do this? Like, what are they, like, well, how did they benefit from this, right? And then you get into, well, there's a lot of doubt in the official story as far as if you believe those steps and you don't ask, what's the chain of custody on the evidence? What's the actual evidence? You have trouble identifying airliners specifically or hijackers specifically. You look into the call. There's all sorts of anomalies, but people don't find that if they think they know already. So.
Yeah, and I came across a lot of that in an older book that is kind of forgotten now, Crossing the Rubicon by
Mike Rupert.
Rupert, right, yeah. So let's hold that thought. We're going to come back after a minute break here, and we're talking with Richard Grove of TragedyandHope.com. All right, we're back. This is our final segment, talking with Richard Grove. This is Jay Dyer of jaysanalysis.com, and you're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. I want to say again, check out talknetwork.com and all of the organic products that you can find there through Natural News. So we've got our final 13 minutes. Richard, we were getting into some really meaty, good stuff here. We're talking about 9/11. We're talking about insider trading, things that are forgotten. People don't come across these kinds of articles that are out there. And we mentioned Crossing the Rubicon by Michael Rupert, which has a whole bunch of really insightful sections and chapters, especially towards the end, that hit on topics that again, have forgotten, is the arcana and lore of 9/11. You were telling us about the insurance fraud, the put options and all that. And it made me think of, I did an analysis of the Bond film Casino Royale, the one with Daniel Craig, to tie this all kind of back together. And if you remember the plot, part of that plot is that there's going to be a major terror event involving planes, and the terror network in that, which is Mads Mikkelsen is playing Le Chiffre,
yeah,
the cipher, which is what that name means, is about to make a whole bunch of money through put options through a big terror event that he's organized.
Yeah, I remember clipping that out for one of my earlier films because I was just trying to show people, it's like, this is on the radar of people with immense budgets. And when you look at, like I said, Ian Fleming's family, he comes from a banking family. That same banking family, sends their kids to school with the same kids that are going into the intelligence realm. And there's a heavy intermixture between the top of their entertainment industry and what you see as intelligence. Casino Royale, that was Fleming's first book, and they only made it as a movie seriously recently. They made that comedy back in 1968. It didn't really do it justice.
Peter Sellers, it's pretty silly. But yeah, and in fact, in that first novel, there's actually false flag terror is in the original novel story.
Well, that's the theme of British intelligence history. If you look at it, you can go all the way back to the Bolshevik Revolution. But getting back to 9/11, Corbett put that video out recently, the 9/11 Trillions video, which I thought was excellent because his 9/11 conspiracy theory, the 5-minute one, that got a lot of people's attention. But a lot of people like to dig in and see if they can find new facts beyond what he's presenting. So to give the hour version, it gives people a lot to dig into and think about. And when you mention the insurance fraud, Marsh and AIG got busted for insurance fraud. It went on from after 9/11. This is where Elliot Spitzer met his demise because when he was investigating, Marsh ended up taking the guy who mentored Spitzer and making him their CEO to basically block them from investigating. And there's a whole bunch of articles that were written about it back in the day. But basically, Marsh and AIG conspired to cheat their customers out of billions of dollars, and they had to pay a fine that was like trivial. It was a slap on the wrist. So it shows, like, they were already showing that crime pays. When you compare that to Larry Silverstein's insurance claim and that the fraud that went on with all of that, where he doubled his money and all this other stuff, like, that's all very suspicious. If you tried to do anything like that, you would be investigated and you'd probably end up in jail. And these other people are like going free. And yet we pretend that we live in a free country where it's like we have unequal treatments as individuals compared to the people with money. And that's a class system. That's a caste system. Mm-hmm. And that's something that America was never about, but has totally been, has succumbed to in definitely the past century. But we can do something about it because we have the ability to observe what's going on and learn and invent and be curious about these things and work our way forward.
We touched on this, and then we kind of went past it. So thank you for that on the 9/11 insider trading. That was really good, brief rundown of that. But we didn't get into Kubrick. I don't want to leave that out. And I was actually wrong. We've got 2 more segments to go here. So when you look at Hollywood and, you're on Esoteric Hollywood and you think about what it is and how it functions, what kind of an organ it is for getting information and ultimately, I think, propaganda out, what do you see when you look at Hollywood? What do you see it as?
Well, I see it as a monopoly through most of the 20th century. It had some competition early on from like the German and Russian film industries, like in the 20s. But that all got crushed out in those wars, didn't it? And it kind of left the Anglo-American film establishment, whether it's coming out of Pinewood Studios or coming out of Hollywood, it's a very similar tone, very much agreement between the countries. And so you do definitely see it as a mouthpiece, and you definitely see it as a way to change culture because you got people's attention in the theater, and there's all sorts of stuff about, that. And now content being so big because the internet and, everyone's got a TV, a big flat screen TV and 1,000 channels to watch, and they need new content for all that stuff. But you're not seeing them produce the content that leads people back to freedom very much, if at all, out there. And if it is, it's kind of snuck into a script like the recent Captain America movie. Yeah, those guys might have been in the know, but, look at the overall effect of the whole system that we're dealing with here. It's not really gaining us a whole lot of ground quick. I think I liked Kubrick from the beginning, from the perspective that he's a director who knew how to do everything on the set. He knew how to do everything himself. He might not be the best at it, but he at least knew how to do all these other jobs so he could understand the other person's position that he was working with. And I think that I tried to integrate that into my film learning how to make a film and filmmaking style, that, someday I might have the resources to have more people help me. But right now, it's like, if I want the sound to be right, I better get it right. If I want the lighting to be right, I better get it right. If I want the camera exposure and everything to be right, I better get that right. And so for me, it's it's a great challenge to interview somebody like William Binney or Patrick Wood or John Loftus or John Taylor Gatto, because I've got to do 1,000 things right. And if I miss a couple of these things, you're going to notice it. And you might not be, you might ignore it because it's not such a big thing. But if I get the sound off for 5 hours, that's going to be annoying, right? If he's underexposed for 5 hours and you can't see him, that's going to be pretty annoying. So it's a good challenge to get to know myself and improve, because I make mistakes every time. I try to minimize the mistakes and learn from the ones that I did last time and not repeat them. But from a perspective of studying filmmakers, Kubrick was, I think he's one of my favorite filmmakers for sure, if not the number one. And I think there's a pattern across these movies. I think he's trying to communicate something to me. There's a common theme across all his films. They're about sociopaths or psychopaths, and he's saying, hey.
Yeah.
There's actually a famous quote that he made where basically, to paraphrase it, he said, don't get close to real power, because real power is it's not something you want to be close to. Those people do basically fucked up things. Those people do absurd and untoward and evil things. So.
Do you have an opinion on, let's say, a film like Eyes Wide Shut? Do you think, this is something that's kind of debated out there in the internet realms, the ether. Do you think he was, do you see that as revelation of the method where he's kind of toying with the audience, or do you think he's really trying to show people that, this is the kind of elite deviancy that goes on with these sort of sex cults and things like that?
I think that, the story that I've heard, which I think is credible, is that he was, after the screening, he was approached and he was told to change the movie, and he was, resisting that in Stanley's way, said no, and the movie ended up being changed, and he ended up being dead. And so I'm not saying there's any connection to Wag the Dog and directors who don't cooperate with CIA and MI6 or anything like that. I'm just saying that I think Stanley was, he was a person who didn't want to leave his property, and that doesn't seem like someone in his position, who has all the resources to be able to travel the world and have a lot of fun. I think that he got too close to power, and he might have gotten asked to do some things that were against his free will and forced or whatever. And have you seen the mockumentary that they made in 2001? It was like part truth, part mockumentary, so nobody got killed.
Mm-mm.
What is it? It's not Kubrick's Odyssey. It's not Kubrick's Gold. It was made a long time ago. And basically, it opens up with, after, January of 2000, and they opened this box, and Kubrick had these instructions. And then they go and interview. There's interviews with Rumsfeld and Alexander Haig and a couple people who were just actors. Because you got to look it up. There's part of it, is accurate, and it's taking real things out of context to tell you a story. What is the story being told? That the government at the time probably couldn't do some of the things it wanted, and it called on a filmmaker to help make Pinewood Studios a little bit more famous in the British world.
Well, we do know that the Air Force and the CIA did take an interest in Kubrick's work, and they were particularly piqued by the ability that he had to what he did with 2001 in terms of the special effects, and what they saw there as a tremendous way to present, the space odyssey, and how this technology in terms of visual effects could be possibly used by government and the CIA and NASA and so forth. So, then
he had that
true.
And then he had that beautiful lighting and Barry Lyndon, and I don't know how, as a filmmaker, I don't know what kind of lens you would have to have with an aperture so big to be able to film people by candlelight, because I know how much light it takes to actually put on a person to make it look normal, like they're not lit.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, if you were just looking, I don't know, how did he get that Zeiss lens? Did NASA loan it to him for Barry Lyndon? If so, why? I don't know. These are questions for individuals to answer for themselves. I'm just saying, as a filmmaker, Kubrick, they're not making people like him anymore, and hopefully that none of us have to go on his ride.
I see a lot of similarities between Barry Lyndon and Lolita and Eyes Wide Shut.
Okay, so can I just dip in just to Lolita for a second, because that's a Nabokov book, right?
Right.
If you look at, there's a great book by Robin Winks called Cloak and Gown, and it's how the American and British intelligence systems used the universities and put teachers in there and recruited students. And Nabokov and his cousin are both involved in the same infrastructure. And Epstein used to be a teacher's assistant for Nabokov. So one of the questions I want to ask him is, hey, tell me about the Nabokov lectures, because I heard they're really popular. Like, people would line up to try to get into his lectures, and there was this whole so there's somebody that we can talk to that actually knew these people, right. And I'm excited to be able to, here's Victor Nabokov, and here's his cousin, and here's their here's mm-hmm. how they're brought into these infrastructures and influential in American and British audiences, and what types of ideas are being circulated. How is that changing our culture? How might it be different than the values and morals that Americans had in the first place?
Yeah.
Right?
Right. Now, and that's hitting on what I'm getting at, is that what you see with Lolita, with Barry Lyndon, with The Shining and Eyes Wide Shut, is that question of the caste system, the oligarchy, their elite sexual deviancy, and those who might try to aspire to be in those circles when they're, from the oligarch perspective, not part of that caste, right? So we see that with Barry, right? Barry tries to get into the nobility, he tries to get into that wealthy class of the British elite, and we see that with Bill Harford in Eyes Wide Shut, where he's tempted to try to get into, the sex cult with all the really powerful people, and so we see these themes quite a bit. That's ultimately how The Shining ends as well, where Jack Nicholson's character, he ends his journey, however you view it, whether it's a spiritual realm or a psychic journey, his own mental madness or whatever. But it ends with that iconic scene of the elite party in the gold ballroom. And he's either immortalized or always been a part of that cast. And it always involves sexual deviancy. So I see that as an important part too, especially with what we see regarding Savile and all these British prime ministers and so forth in terms of just the utterly reprobate mindset of that group.
Well, I'd also likewise thought of Jimmy Savile while you were talking about that, because if you want to look at the relationship between entertainment in Britain and the royal class system over there, it's like that's the connection. And BBC helping to cover it up for like 30 years and all these different victims.
Right,
it's like
hold that thought, Richard, on Savile, and we're going to take a 2-minute break here and come back. You want a break?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Drink some water real quick. All right, we're back. We're talking about Kubrick and Hollywood. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. I'm your host, Jay Dyer. We're talking to Richard Grove of TragedyAndHope.com. Richard, you were just talking about your thoughts on Savile and that elite pedophile deviancy that we see in the news now that, we saw hinted at in films that Kubrick made, things like Eyes Wide Shut. So tell us your thoughts on that.
Well, I think it's another ominous continuity in the pattern of the Anglophile establishment, the Anglo-American establishment, because you've got characters back in, the late 1800s, early 1900s, like Cecil Rhodes, who's creating like the prototype for what became the Boy Scouts in America. Mm-hmm. And then you see when you investigate the scouting movement and some of the people that are involved with the creation of these different major movements, and they're ex-MI6 agents. They're special operations executive agents.
They even have a secret society. What is it? The Arrow, something.
Arrow of Light or something like that.
Something
I don't know those things personally, but I've heard of them. So, you see Cecil Rhodes creating these prototypes because they were, they had scouts in Rhodesia back then because he had named a colony after him. He's got this stuff going on back then. And this is all engaged in British intelligence. It's connected into Freemasonry. So when you think of Freemasonry, these things are not disconnected in British class system. It's all like these are just different layers of their outfit. So Cecil Rhodes is a Freemason. He's also a British imperialist. He's also funded by the Rothschilds. He's also in charge of De Beers, which, becomes a multinational conglomerate cartel that was illegally, couldn't work in America, couldn't establish itself in America until recently. And that should tell you something, that they're allowed to operate here as a cartel. Mm-hmm. And there's all these different aspects, but it's not just the Freemasons. It's not just the guys from Oxford. It's not just the Rhodes Scholars. It's not just the Skull and Bones. It's not just the CFR. It's not just the Trilateral Commission. It's not just Bilderberg. There's commonalities between all those working groups and systems. Yeah. And they're all against American freedom. They're against freedom of the individual.
Well, and they're against nation states too, in general.
Yes, at this point, yes, because they're at their part of the plan where they think they can take over the globe, and they got a good head start on it, and they got lots of plans and words on papers and all this good stuff. But my thinking is that's all because nobody's really resisting it in large numbers, because the critical mass of critical evidence and information and artifacts hasn't been yet presented in such a palatable form, mm-hmm. and that only early adopters and people really paying attention have gotten it thus far. But my hope through creating media and creating movies and podcasts and such is to eventually, find the right people to work with where we can get this message out where it's like, oh, that's just common knowledge now that that's how it works, and it doesn't have to be gone against without resistance, that we all just don't have to participate against our will in something that has become systematic and just inseparable from Americans. It's like no one can think about not paying their property taxes to support a compulsory school system, or that the fact that all these tax dollars being used in the Defense Department budget, it's coming from us. It's being added to the national debt. It's indenturing our kids and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and it's going to lead to the end of this country, which if this country goes, then you're just left with what? A bunch of British English-speaking territories all over the place? Like that's just going to, like, you know, it's going to be using the resources of America without our participation at all.
Let's just go into a technocratic mercantilism where, you know, we're just completely vassals of, you know, these big smart cities and smart grids or something, right? I mean, it just sounds like, that's total technocratic nightmare. That's
the caste system that's in 1984, A Brave New World. Or there was both of those books were influenced by a 1921 book written by someone in the Soviet Union named Yevgeny Zemyatin. And it was a book called We, and you could look it up. It's in the history blueprint, and you'll find that it's a one world state where they live in a glass city that's got a glass dome over it. Mm-hmm. So it's a panopticon. It's a surveillance state. It's a technocracy. And so whether it's Metropolis by Fritz Lang back, 1928, something like that, there's been a bunch of movies and books that, you know, they label as dystopia, but they're reflecting what was going on at the time, and people who were directors and writers trying to reflect it back to the public and say, hey, look, this doesn't end so well for the people who don't resist the tyranny because it overcomes everything.
Well, that's the whole point of Brave New World, is that at the end, when Mustafa Aman is talking to John the Savage and they're having their climactic dialogue, he says, Mustafa Aman, who's the world socialist dictator, says, or controller, one of 10, he tells John the Savage, he says, why are you trying to rile these people up for revolution? They hate you. They don't want that. They want to go along with it. So John the Savage learns the hard way that when he tries to be, you know, Socrates in the allegory of the cave, you know, he comes out and then he goes back to free the prisoners. That's really the question of responsibility here. You know, it's a question of, are we going to be responsible? Are we going to choose to oppose it, or are we going to choose our own doom willingly? We're responsible for ourselves, and going along with this, which will ultimately, I think the whole goal is just to make sure that the masses don't extend their progeny into the future.
Yeah, I think it's about, you know, like Huxley said in 63, about getting people to love their servitude and using pharmacological methods and media methods to just basically occupy people's time so that they don't realize that they're contributing to their own enslavement. But once you stop and realize that and fulfill yourself, you know, you give yourself a foundation of the facts that kind of lead up to that, you might want to think a little bit for yourself. You know, once you have that, then you can move forward in the direction that you choose. And it's not necessarily fulfilling somebody else's goals and dreams, but it might be fulfilling your dreams. And I have a dream that, you know, future generations in this particular landmass will continue to experience freedom, and that maybe other places will experience freedom, not at the you know, gunpoint or bomb point of threats, but just because they figured out that it's cool to not hit and not steal. And if we can all just kind of, you know, chill like that, then we don't need to spend all these billions of dollars on weapons of mass destruction and create all these situations that are so toxic to future generations.
Great point. Great point. So you think that there is a real possibility of changing things? Because I don't think that nature and its wisdom put humanity here to fail, but I do think that we are in the midst of a learning curve, and we got to learn our way through it. And you know, if we continue doing things without learning, it's going to lead to, you know, calamity and not a good form of chaos. You know, the absence of leadership or rulers, when you have a population that's self-reliant and has self-esteem and self-confident because they know how to do things themselves, that's not chaos. That's just, you know, that's a country that you don't want to invade, where they don't have a system to control everybody and everybody knows how to defend themselves intellectually and physically. Wow, that would be hard to take that over. Gee, why are we not like that? You know? Yeah. Richard, I have a question for you. I ask this sometimes to well-read guests and people that I interview. Other than Tragedy and Hope, and maybe, you know, aside from Quigley, what are a couple books that really stand out to you as works that impacted you? And then a couple films that really stand out as changing you in some way in your mindset. Could be a documentary, could be fictional.
Books other than Tragedy and Hope that would still pertain to the same line of history would be The Last Will and Testament of Cecil John Rhodes, which was published in 1902, which includes his last will, where he describes the secret society that he wanted his resources to create, and the Rhodes scholarships, and the purpose of taking over America and making it part of the colonies again. I think that's an artifact of history that every American should own, because we should be defending against that plan because it's still in action. Mm-hmm. It's not a documentary. It's a movie made by, I think it was a British director, Richard Attenborough, called Cry Freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about Steve Biko living under apartheid in South Africa. So the system that Cecil Rhodes' legacy creates eventually someone who resists effectively, a freedom fighter named Stephen Biko. And it chronicles the story of how he was persecuted, made a state prisoner, and eventually they killed him. And the interesting part is if you watch the credits at the end, they'll list all the other suspicious deaths around that time, like all these prisoners just accidentally falling down steps and breaking their necks and all these different things that happened. That shows that there was such a pattern of corruption that these police weren't even so conscious as to check each other, what stations are reporting what. So you got all these people like reporting these crazy reasons for death of these political prisoners. So there's a lot of overlap and contradictions that even a casual viewer, someone who's not interested in all this research yet, could be like, wait a minute, what's the history behind how something like that happened? And why did we have to wait till 1984, 87 for that movie to be produced? Because it's still going on today, and they don't want to tell you about stuff that's going on until a little time has passed. Other books that that are very useful on a regular basis to me that I use a lot in my work would be the 4-volume set by Charles Seymour. And it's the private papers of Colonel House.
Oh, wow.
Wow. And I have a first edition copy. It's printed, it's published by Yale. There's still copies. You can get the set out there. If you're a thrifty used antique book, shopper, these can be found. And in there, he clearly describes all these personal letters with the Warburgs and the Schiffs and the Loebs and all the Rothschild infrastructure and setting up the Federal Reserve and guiding Wilson through World War I and Paris Peace Treaty. I think Paris 1919 by Margaret Macmillan. She's the great granddaughter of Lloyd George, David Lloyd George, who was a prime minister during World War I. Or maybe it was Harold Macmillan. Maybe Harold Macmillan was her great grandfather. I thought it was Lloyd George though. Anyway, so it's an establishment view on Paris 1919, but she clearly illustrates there's a whole chapter on the Zionist connection and in there talking about the influence that they had during World War I. She's talking about the bankers. So there's a lot even if you read the establishment version of books that you can dig into to find the lesser known facts through these other books that are available out there.
Right. Do you have much time for fiction?
The last fiction book I read was called The Witness Tree. It was by John Loftus, and I forget his co-author on that. It's a very well written fictional novel that's based on their readings of intelligence documents. So in the back, they decrypt it with, here's the real information from which the story was made. And it's actually, the documents are more interesting than the story, but the story is very well told. So it's about the Dulles brothers, how they bump off Eleanor's would-be husband or her husband because she married a Jewish guy, how they were racist and Nazis, and basically how the Zionists had blackmailed Nelson Rockefeller in order to get Israel approved by the United Nations. They needed Nelson Rockefeller's Latin American votes, and how that blackmail went down, according to Loftus in his interview of one of the agents who blackmailed Nelson Rockefeller. So he talked to the guy who was one of the guys who was in the room. It was over the Rockefellers and Dulles being his attorney covering up their funding of the Nazis and a bunch of different corporate operations in Germany during World War II. So trading with the enemy, espionage, all that sort of stuff was swept under the rug. And this is all talked about in the John Loftus interview that I'll be releasing hopefully in October.
Awesome. So what I was about to ask you, what can we look forward to in the near future from tragedyandhope.com? And I guess it would be, of course, the Loftus interview. Anything else as we come into the last minute and a half of the show?
Sure. I'm working on Peace Revolution episode 90 right now. It's on self-defense and self-protection. And that's one of the hallmarks of freedom, self-protection and self-defense. Intellectual self-defense and non-aggression makes that nice little triangle of freedom. I'm also working on the 7-hour interview with John Loftus, which I'm going to I'll release it in several different parts. And then I've got more interviews scheduled for later this year for the Future of Freedom Project, which is a film I'm making.
Awesome. TragedyandHope.com. Go and check it out. Sign up. Support Rich, $4.95 a month, and then get the DVDs, get the documentaries. We are running out of time. We've come to the end. I want to thank Richard for coming. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. I'm your host, Jay Dyer of jaysanalysis.com. Also look for my forthcoming book from Trine Day next spring, which will be Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film. So you can follow Rich at the site. I think he's also on Twitter, correct?
Yeah, it's at Tragedy and Hope.
All right. And definitely check out talknetwork.com and all